Yeah, there's a few things we should be looking for. I guess the thing of most interest is, are we going to see any sign of a successor? And if there's no one in this group who's under the age of 60, then there's no successor in there, because the way he's looking is another 2 terms at least of him in power and then handing over to someone else. So it's hard to see. There's 2 options. One, he could clear the slate and kind of get rid of a lot of people by shifting the age limits, or he could go with the sort of a stability approach and just let the 2 who are due to retire and replace them with a couple of safe choices.
Bill, what are your thoughts? What do you expect to see?
Well, Bev, I suppose the only real key thing aside from the successor is whether or not Xi Jinping manages to stack the top cabinet with his loyalists. If he does, then he'll be around for a long time, you would presume. But if he doesn't, if the makeup of the top cabinet, the Politburo Standing Committee, is a little bit more mixed in the backgrounds of the men, and they all will be men who are in that position, then perhaps that will indicate a bit of a bit more internal debate at the top level over the next few years about China's direction than you would get if it's just a Xi show of loyalists.
Yeah. How, when we think back to Deng Xiaoping, to both of you, he enshrined these set terms that are about to be basically set aside and rolled over to prevent this kind of power grab, this long-term power situation where one man rules the roost. How damaging is this potentially going to be for China?
Well, I mean, we're moving into kind of cult territory, if you like, and that is very dangerous. China's been through this before with Mao. The only difference being, as a friend of mine, Jeremy Barmay, put it, it's a cult of personality without the personality. And so where do you go from here? Because you don't have the predictability of succession. You don't know who's going to take over. And that leads to all kinds of cult-like behaviours where the feedback loops don't work anymore. He's surrounded by sycophants who are basically competing amongst each other to come up with formulations that please him the most. And then you get this real disconnect from the reality of China, which is, incredibly complex to run. And if you're getting bad feedback, then you're making bad decisions.
Bill?
Yeah, Bev, I haven't seen anybody advocate a case for continuing the leadership of Xi Jinping. A few years ago, you'd have some loyalists in, say, Chinese state media who would say, look, if that one man is running the show in a really strong way, then why would you want to get rid of him if he's taking the country in a more confident, stronger direction? You don't really hear much of that now with the COVID-0 economic slump, with Xi Jinping's rather poorly timed decision to declare an all-out friendship with Russia right before Putin invaded Ukraine. The gloss has really come off this bloke, and the idea that he should continue his rule unopposed, possibly with even more loyalists underneath him right at the top of the party. I haven't seen anybody making a strong defence of this in the lead-up, possibly because the system is so opaque that even though everybody in China and around the world knows that he's going to walk out first over the weekend and once again commence a 5-year term, nobody officially will say it in the government structure, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it.
Yeah. In his opening speech, I think that the notion of being on a war footing or a war preparedness was mentioned about 89 or 90 times compared to the economic focus that we've seen of recent congresses. What does this mean? What does China want to be? We know, of course, that it wants Taiwan back in the fold, but what does this mean for how China sees itself on the global stage?
Bill, do you want to go first?
Well, I'll just, on this, the point was made by an Australian long-term observer of China, Chris Buckley, one of Australia's top experts on China, New York Times journalist, that up until this Congress, in recent Congresses, Xi or previous leaders had said that China is in a period of strategic opportunity, which basically meant that the country should focus on economic growth. But that sort of language is being stripped out this year, and instead Xi Jinping is warning of uncertain times ahead. He talked about headwinds, even the possibility of devastating storms. He said we need to prepare for worst case scenarios. So this clearly means that China does not see a sort of golden opportunity simply to pump up its economy as fast as possible anymore, probably because we've already they've realised in recent years it's not as easy to sustain high levels of growth. But the second thing is the opposition in recent years to Xi Jinping's government from particularly the United States, but also its allies, including in Australia, has mounted pretty quickly. There's been a lot of pushback. Democracies around the world taking measures to try and strengthen their systems against things like Chinese government influence and Chinese economic takeovers of strategic companies in Europe and so forth. So I think and just in the last couple of days, Joe Biden has made a big stance on US chip technology going to China. He's put in place measures that apparently, according to multiple accounts, are making an impact on China's ability to obtain high-level chips. So I think all these things are quite obvious now, and the idea that opportunity abounds is not really the flavour of the month anymore in China. It is much more of a sort of bunker down mentality, us against the world, and that's kind of the tone that you got from Xi Jinping's opening speech.
Yeah, and I'd add that, I mean, for Xi Jinping himself, this whole idea of struggle is a very personal thing. So in his own life, his own family was one of the most roughly treated in the Cultural Revolution. And the lesson he took from it wasn't that the party could get things really badly wrong. It was that, you had to suffer to become a good Communist Party member. So the audience for the Party Congress isn't so much us, it's all the party members, 90 million plus back in China. And he's telling them basically, you have to be like me, this is going to be hard, but hard is what's good and struggle is what's good. So this is what people are having to turn up and study, almost to death throughout China, and will have to study even further in the wake of the Congress.
Yeah, indeed. It's very much like Putin stuck in his KGB suspicion of anything outside of the Soviet Union. It's that he's trapping China now in a different mindset. Bill, we were talking earlier about those comments made out as a consequence of the Manchester protest. And we should remind people that you were forced out of the country, and as there was this crackdown on free reporting, any form of dissent. We've seen it in China brutally, but what's fascinating now is this push for greater foreign influence, this desire to believe that any China representation, be it the diaspora or a consulate or an embassy, is up to China to decide how they operate that.
Yeah, and it's not new for the Chinese leader or for the Chinese Communist Party to tell the nation to be on guard against Western values. But Xi Jinping really doubled down on this in particularly the second term, making speeches which over time were, if they weren't public initially, they were subsequently revealed and publicised, where he told various cadres, we need to fully reject Western notions of democracy, of rule of law, of independent judiciary, of a Western concept of journalism. He really has tried to reinforce this idea that China is basically in an ideological battle with these Western notions. And we're seeing this spill out across all fronts at places like the United Nations. Chinese diplomats had a huge win in recent weeks when they were able to thwart an attempt led by the US, but also countries like Australia, to have a UN debate about the report by the UN Human Rights Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Xinjiang. And the Chinese government was able to rally the numbers and get enough countries to knock down that idea of having a debate. So across all fronts, I think Xi Jinping has quite clearly locked into a very ideological worldview. It's China and fellow authoritarian states, but led by China, versus Western states that are all out to contain China, plus nations like Japan. And I don't know how seriously people in the West have been taking this idea of a conflict between the two, but Xi Jinping, from his language in the opening speech, is a hardcore ideologue, a hardcore true believer. And it's probably a good time, I suppose, for people to understand that, rather than for people to kind of dismiss him simply as a cynical politician who says all this Marxist rhetoric simply for his own political power.
And Graeme, does that lead to, you know, there's greater sort of tentacles of foreign interference, which was also referenced today?
Yeah, this certainly leads to greater paranoia about tentacles of foreign interference. I mean, we've seen them drink this Kool-Aid before. I mean, in the wake of Tiananmen, rather than blaming it on corruption or rampant inflation, they blamed it on George Soros. You know, for goodness sake. Taiwan, likewise, in the rhetoric about Taiwan in his speech, all these references to external forces. So basically saying the US has cooked up all this opposition to reunification, you know, missing the fact that less than 2% of Taiwanese people want to be reunified with the mainland. Like, it's amazing if the US could have done that, but unfortunately, largely it's China's own efforts at disinformation, at cyber attacks in Taiwan that have really pushed them away from the mainland, not anything the US in its ineffectual Voice of America kind of way has managed to do.
It feels, just a final question to you both, and a brief one, it feels like it's going to be difficult for any nation, and Bill talked a bit about China-Australia relations, but for any nation to have proper relations, proper, you know, bilateral relations with China into the future.
Yeah, I'll just chip in, Bev, and say that I think the easier days, the peak of Australia-China relations have well and truly passed. That was probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. That's the same for China-US. Any China-European nation relationship has basically peaked, because how on earth can you build more trustworthy, more integrated ties with a leadership in China that is so utterly paranoid, as Graeme says, about any form of Western influence or Western involvement within China itself?
Final word to you, Graeme.
Look, it's difficult, and we have Xiao Qian, who is there and always puts on a smiling face in public. But the difficulty is the words that he is obliged to say in order to please his bosses back in Beijing send a chill through Anna in Australia. When he used the words about Taiwan, use your imagination for what might happen. Absolutely chilling. And yet this is a guy who's supposedly selling, friendlier relations. You can't use the language that you have as a Chinese diplomat these days and build foreign relations with, you know, democracies. Sure, it might work in Saudi Arabia just fine, but maybe not here.
Yeah, the countries where it is working is mounting up. Great to have you both on. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bev.
Thanks, Bev.